It knew my name, but the voice coming from the woods was my mother's. Why would something in the Appalachian forest imitate the most trusted voice I know? The first thing I noticed was how quiet the woods had become. Not peaceful quiet. Not the kind campers post online with captions like, "Nature heals the soul." I mean the kind of silence that makes your brain start searching for danger before your eyes even know where to look. No crickets, no wind, no birds, just the soft crackling of our campfire, and 4 grown adults suddenly pretending not to notice how uncomfortable they were getting. And somewhere beyond the trees, something knocked against wood. 3 slow taps, like someone gently hitting a baseball bat against a tree trunk. Then it stopped. At the time, we still thought there was a rational explanation for everything. That's the dangerous part about Appalachia. The mountains let you believe that for a while. My name's Daniel, and this happened in eastern Kentucky back in October of 2019. There were 4 of us total. Me, my younger brother Tyler, Tyler's friend Mason, and Mason's uncle Rick, who claimed he knew those mountains better than the locals. That should have been our first warning, because people who actually know Appalachia, they don't brag about it. They respect it, especially after dark. We'd rented an old cabin about 12 miles off the nearest paved road. The listing online described it as rustic and isolated, which turned out to mean no cell signal, no nearby houses, and 1 dirt road in and out. Perfect setting for a relaxing weekend, right? Tyler loved camping. He was one of those guys who watched survival videos non-stop and thought owning a tactical flashlight counted as a personality trait. Mason mostly came because his girlfriend dumped him 2 weeks earlier. And Rick came because he wanted to hunt. He spent the entire drive talking about deer trails, black bears, and how city people panic too easy. That sentence aged horribly. The first strange thing happened before sunset. We were unloading gear near the cabin when Mason suddenly stopped carrying the cooler and stared into the woods. "Did you hear that?" he asked. We all paused. Nothing. Then, faintly, a whistle, far away. 3 short notes, not bird-like, human. Rick immediately looked irritated. Probably hikers, but the way he said it sounded forced, like he wanted the explanation more than he believed it. Tyler laughed it off. "Relax," he said. "Worst case scenario, it's hillbillies with moonshine." Honestly, that got a laugh out of all of us, at least at the time. By nightfall, the temperature dropped hard. The fire became the only comforting thing for miles. The woods around the cabin looked impossibly black. Not dark blue, not shadowy, black, like the trees themselves were swallowing light. And that's when Rick told us the story. Apparently, locals avoided that section of forest because of disappearances going back decades. Hunters, hikers, campers, people gone without a trace. Now, obviously, every small town has stories like that. But Rick didn't tell it like some fun ghost story. He told it quietly, carefully, like he regretted bringing it up halfway through. "There are places out here," he said, staring into the fire, "where you hear things you shouldn't follow." Tyler rolled his eyes immediately. "Oh boy, here we go." Rick ignored him. "If somebody calls your name from the woods at night," he looked directly at us, "don't answer it." Silence settled over the fire. Then Mason smirked nervously. "What if it sounds like somebody we know?" Rick didn't smile. That's the problem. Now at this point, I still didn't believe any supernatural stuff. But I'll admit, something changed in the atmosphere After that conversation, nobody wandered far from the fire anymore. Nobody joked as loudly, and every time the woods creaked, all four of us looked up. Around midnight, Tyler volunteered to grab more firewood from the pile near the tree line. He disappeared into the dark with a flashlight. 10 seconds later, we heard him yell. Not scream, just a sharp, startled yell. We all jumped up immediately. Tyler, no answer. Rick grabbed his rifle, and for the first time all weekend, I saw fear on his face. We hurried toward the tree line and found Tyler standing completely frozen beside the wood pile. His flashlight pointed into the forest. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Then I realized there was another light deeper in the woods. A flashlight, standing perfectly still between the trees, watching us. "Hello," Mason called. The light instantly switched off, just gone. No footsteps, no movement, nothing. The darkness swallowed whoever was out there. Tyler laughed nervously. "Okay, not funny anymore." Rick quietly told everyone to get back inside the cabin. That's when things started escalating. Inside, the cabin suddenly felt too small. Every window looked like an open invitation for something to stare back at us. Tyler kept trying to rationalize it. Probably hunters messing around. But even he sounded uncertain now. Around 1:30 in the morning, we heard footsteps outside. Slow, crunching through leaves, circling the cabin. Mason peeked through the curtains. "I don't see anybody." The footsteps stopped immediately after he said that. Then came 3 knocks on the cabin wall. Not the door, the wall. Knock, knock, knock. Nobody moved. I remember hearing the fire in the stove crackle, while all 4 of us just stared at each other. Then Tyler whispered, "Tell me that was a branch." Another knock answered him. Closer this time, from the back of the cabin. Rick chambered around into the rifle. And that sound, that metallic click, somehow made everything worse, because now the situation felt real. Nobody slept that night. At around 3 a.m., Mason finally muttered that he needed the bathroom. The cabin's plumbing barely worked, so the bathroom was basically an outhouse 20 feet away. Nobody wanted him going alone, but nobody wanted to go with him either. Eventually, Tyler volunteered. The 2 of them stepped outside carrying flashlights. The door shut behind them, and for about 30 seconds, everything was quiet. Then Tyler screamed, not startled, not surprised, terrified. We burst outside immediately. Their flashlights were shaking wildly near the outhouse. "What happened?" I shouted. Tyler couldn't answer. Mason pointed toward the woods. There was someone standing there. Where? Right there. But there was nobody now, just trees. Then we noticed the smell. Rotting, like wet earth mixed with something dead. Rick scanned the darkness with the rifle. "You boys get inside. Now." Nobody argued anymore. Back inside the cabin, Tyler finally explained what he saw. He claimed there was a person standing just beyond the trees, tall, too tall, and according to him, it smiled when the flashlight hit its face. Not a normal smile, a stretched, unnatural grin. Now listen, I know how this sounds. Sleep deprivation, fear, darkness playing tricks on people. That's exactly what I kept telling myself, until the voice started. Around 4 a.m., somebody outside softly said my name. "Daniel." Every hair on my arm stood up instantly. The voice sounded exactly like my mother. Not similar, exact. Same softness, same tone. coming from outside the cabin window. Daniel. Tyler heard it too, because his face immediately lost color. Rick slowly shook his head at us, warning us not to respond. The voice moved along the side of the cabin. Then it spoke again. Closer. It's cold out here. Mason started crying. Not loudly, just silent, terrified tears running down his face. And honestly, I wasn't far behind him, because deep down, every single one of us understood something horrifying in that moment. Whatever was outside was trying to lure us out. Then came the scratching, long, slow scraping across the cabin walls, like fingernails dragging over wood, back and forth, back and forth. The sound lasted nearly 20 minutes. At some point, Tyler whispered, "What if it gets inside?" Nobody answered him, because nobody had an answer. Eventually, dawn finally started bleeding through the windows. Gray light filtered into the trees, and the sounds stopped. Just stopped, completely. The silence afterward felt almost worse. Rick waited another hour before opening the cabin door. The forest looked normal again. Birds chirping, wind moving branches, morning sunlight everywhere. Like the mountain was pretending none of it happened. We packed our things faster than I've ever packed anything in my life. Nobody talked much. We just wanted out. But right before leaving, Mason noticed something beside the cabin. Marks in the dirt, footprints, except they didn't look human. They were long, misshapen, and impossibly deep, like whatever made them weighed several hundred pounds. The tracks circled the entire cabin, over and over and over, then disappeared directly into the woods. Tyler kept trying to joke during the drive home. You know that nervous humor people use when they're close to panicking. At one point he laughed and said, "Well, at least we saved money on a haunted house attraction." Nobody laughed, especially Rick, because Rick looked genuinely disturbed now. About halfway home, he finally spoke, quietly. "There's a reason locals don't whistle in those mountains." Mason stared at him. "What does whistling mean?" Rick hesitated, then said something I still think about constantly. "In Appalachia, if you hear whistling at night," he looked out the truck window, "you're supposed to pray it's human." After that trip, Tyler stopped camping entirely. Mason moved to Florida 6 months later and refuses to discuss that weekend. And Rick sold his hunting property in Kentucky less than a year afterward. As for me, I still wake up sometimes hearing that voice outside the cabin window, soft, patient, pretending to be someone I trust. And the worst part, there's one detail I never told the others. That final morning, while we were loading the truck, I looked back toward the trees one last time, and for just a second, I saw someone standing between them, watching us leave. Tall, unmoving, smiling. Jacob Turner had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for almost 5 years, but nothing in all those years could explain what happened to him near Nantahala National Forest during the fall of 2024. At 27 years old, Jacob loved hiking alone. He liked the silence of the mountains, the cold air, and the feeling of being far away from cities and people. He had already completed many sections of the Appalachian Trail and believed he understood the wilderness better than most people. But there are places in the Appalachian Mountains that even experienced hikers avoid. Places locals refuse to talk about after dark. And Jacob unknowingly walked into one of them. It started on a cloudy October morning. The forest was cold and wet from rain the night before. Thick fog moved slowly through the trees and the mountains around him looked almost black under the dark sky. Jacob had been hiking since sunrise. Around noon, while stopping for water near a rocky slope, he noticed something strange beside the trail, a narrow path. It was hidden behind thick bushes and hard to notice unless someone was looking carefully. The path looked old and unused, but not completely abandoned. Near the entrance stood a large dead tree with deep marks cut into the bark, 3 long scratches crossed by a circle. Jacob had never seen that symbol before. At first, he ignored it, but then he remembered something he had read months earlier on an online hiking forum. Someone had mentioned an abandoned settlement hidden somewhere deep in Nantahala forest. According to the post, strange things happened there. People claimed to hear voices, see lights moving through the trees at night, and sometimes disappear for hours without explanation. Most people online laughed at the story, but a few hikers said the place was real. Jacob had always loved old Appalachian history. He thought maybe he had finally found the hidden location people talked about. So against his better judgment, he stepped off the main trail and followed the narrow path into the woods. At first, everything seemed normal. The path moved downhill through thick forest. Fallen leaves covered the ground, and old trees twisted high above him. But after about 20 minutes, Jacob noticed how quiet everything had become. Too quiet. There were no birds singing, no squirrels moving through branches, no insects, nothing. Even the wind had stopped. The silence felt heavy, almost unnatural. Jacob slowed his pace. Something about the place made him nervous, though he could not explain why. The deeper he went, the darker the forest became. The trees grew closer together, blocking most of the daylight. Thick roots crossed the ground like giant snakes, and fog moved slowly between the trunks. Then Jacob heard it, a voice, very faint. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then he heard it again, someone whispering. He stopped walking immediately. The whisper came from somewhere ahead of him. He could not understand the words, but it sounded human. "Hello," Jacob shouted. The whispering stopped. Silence again. Jacob waited several seconds, then laughed nervously to himself. Probably another hiker, he thought. He continued walking. A few minutes later, the whispering returned. This time, there were multiple voices, low and quiet, like several people talking far away. Jacob could not understand what they were saying, but something about the sound made his stomach tighten. The voices did not sound normal. They sounded old. He kept moving carefully down the path until he finally reached a small open area deep inside the valley. And that was when he saw the ruins. Broken stone walls, collapsed wooden buildings, rusted farming tools sticking out of the ground. It looked like an entire village had once existed there before being swallowed by the forest. Jacob slowly walked through the ruins, looking around in disbelief. Whoever had lived there had been gone for a very long time. Most of the buildings had collapsed completely. Moss covered the stones, and small trees now grew through the floors of old cabins. But something about the place felt wrong. The damage did not look natural. Several buildings looked burned. Black marks stained the remaining stone chimneys. And in the center of the settlement stood something that made Jacob freeze. A row of small mounds in the ground. Graves, at least 15 of them. None had names. None had crosses. Just rough piles of dirt and stone. Jacob suddenly heard the whispering again, but this time it was much closer. Right behind him, He spun around quickly. Nobody was there. Then a man's voice clearly spoke from somewhere in the trees. "You shouldn't be here." Jacob's heart started pounding. "Who's there?" he shouted. No answer. Then another voice spoke. A woman this time. "They need to leave." A child began crying somewhere deep in the woods. Jacob backed away slowly. The voices continued. "They came at night. They burned us alive. They locked the doors." Jacob felt cold all over. Every hair on his arm stood up. The voices sounded completely real, but the forest around him was empty. Then he noticed something even worse. The temperature had suddenly dropped. His breath became visible in the air, and a strange smell filled the valley. Smoke, wet dirt, and blood. Old blood. Jacob grabbed his backpack and started walking quickly back toward the trail. But after several minutes, he realized something terrifying. The path was gone. No matter where he turned, he only saw trees and fog. The forest no longer looked familiar. Panic started building in his chest. He pulled out his phone. No signal. His GPS would not load. Even worse, his compass spun wildly in circles. That was when the voices became louder. Now they surrounded him from every direction. Dozens of people speaking at once. Some crying, some screaming, some whispering directly into his ears. "You can't leave. Stay with us. Don't let him escape." Jacob started running. Branches hit his face as he pushed through the woods. He slipped down muddy hills, crashed through bushes, and kept moving as fast as possible. Behind him, footsteps followed, slow at first, then faster. Crunch, 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 like several people walking through dead leaves behind him. Jacob looked back for only a second and immediately wished he hadn't. Shapes moved between the trees, human shapes. Tall, dark figures standing silently in the fog. Some looked burned black. Others looked twisted and broken. One of them looked like a little girl holding someone's hand, but the person beside her had no face. Jacob turned forward again and ran harder than he ever had in his life. The forest seemed endless. Every direction looked the same, and the voices kept getting closer. Then suddenly, everything went silent. Completely silent. Jacob stopped running and looked around carefully. The fog around him had grown thick. So thick, he could barely see a few feet ahead. That was when he noticed the lantern. A dim orange light glowing between the trees. Someone was standing there holding it. An old woman. She wore dark clothes that looked very old-fashioned, almost from another century. Her face looked pale and tired. She stared directly at Jacob. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the woman slowly raised one hand and pointed behind him. "Run," she whispered. Jacob heard screaming explode through the forest. Not human screaming. Something much worse. The old woman suddenly vanished into the fog, and dark figures began moving rapidly between the trees around him. Jacob ran again. This time, the forest around him seemed alive. Branches moved on their own. Whispers came from every direction. Several times, he thought he felt hands touching his backpack and jacket from behind. Then finally, he saw the Appalachian trail marker nailed to a tree ahead. Jacob nearly collapsed with relief. He stumbled back onto the main trail, just as rain started pouring from the sky. And then something terrifying happened. All the voices stopped instantly, as if whatever had followed him could not cross back onto the trail. Jacob looked behind him one last time. Far back in the trees, dozens of pale figures stood silently watching him. Then the fog swallowed them whole. Jacob made it to a ranger station late that night, exhausted and covered in cuts and mud. He tried explaining what happened, but the rangers blamed dehydration and fear. Still shaken, Jacob later searched local historical records online. What he found made his blood run cold. In 1893, a small isolated community deep inside Nantahala Forest disappeared after a fire destroyed the settlement. According to newspaper reports, nearly everyone died. The strange part was what witnesses claimed afterward. Several rescue workers reported hearing voices in the woods. Others claimed they saw people standing between trees at night, even though the entire village had burned down. Eventually, the area was abandoned completely. Locals began calling it the Lost Hollow, and over time, maps stopped showing the settlement entirely. Jacob never returned to Nantahala National Forest, but even now, almost 2 years later, he still wakes up some nights hearing faint whispers outside his bedroom window. And sometimes, just before the whispers disappear, he hears the same warning spoken softly in the dark. "You should have stayed away." The first scream came from inside the tunnel at exactly 1:14 a.m. Not a grown man, not an animal, a little girl. And the worst part, Caleb Mercer had checked that abandoned mine himself earlier that evening. It was empty, completely empty. Caleb Mercer had spent most of his life outdoors. At 21 years old, he worked as a volunteer guide for a youth hiking program in eastern Tennessee and had more backcountry experience than most adults twice his age. He knew how to navigate difficult terrain, build shelter in heavy rain, and stay calm when things went wrong in the wilderness. That was exactly why the Knoxville Outdoor Club asked him to scout a section of trail near the abandoned mining areas outside Frozen Head State Park before bringing a group of teenagers there for a weekend expedition. The assignment sounded simple: check campsite conditions, mark water sources, look for hazards. Caleb expected 3 quiet days in the mountains. Instead, he found something waiting beneath them. He arrived on a cold Thursday afternoon in October of 2023. The forest around Frozen Head was already covered in deep orange and red leaves, and the mountains were wrapped in a heavy gray fog that never fully lifted throughout the day. By sunset, Caleb had reached an isolated clearing nearly 6 miles from the nearest trailhead. The area had once been used during Tennessee's coal mining days decades earlier, and traces of that history still remained. Rusting metal rails disappeared into the trees. Broken machinery sat half buried in the dirt, and about 200 yards uphill from his campsite was an old mine entrance sealed with rotting wooden boards. Before setting up camp, Caleb walked over to inspect it. The tunnel was narrow, dark, and smelled like wet stone and old earth. He shined his flashlight through gaps in the wood and could only see about 20 feet inside before the darkness swallowed the beam completely. No footprints, no fresh damage, no signs anyone had been there recently. Satisfied it was safe enough to avoid, he headed back to camp. The first few hours passed normally. He cooked dinner over a small stove, wrote notes for the hiking club, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. Then, a little after 1 a.m., he woke suddenly to the sound of singing, soft, faint, a child's voice somewhere in the forest. At first, Caleb thought he was dreaming, but then the singing came again. A little girl humming what sounded like an old church hymn. The sound drifted through the trees from uphill, from the direction of the mine. Caleb sat upright inside his tent, listening carefully. The voice stopped. Silence covered the woods for several seconds. Then came a single sentence. "Can somebody help me?" Caleb's stomach tightened immediately. No child should have been anywhere near that area, especially not at 1 in the morning. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside. The forest felt wrong the second he entered it. No insects, no owls, no wind. Just complete silence, broken only by the distant sound of the girl softly crying somewhere uphill. Caleb followed the voice carefully through the darkness until he reached the abandoned mine entrance again. The crying was coming from inside. "Hello," Caleb called out. No answer. Then the girl whispered, "He won't let me leave." The words echoed unnaturally through the tunnel. Caleb moved closer and shined his flashlight between the broken wooden boards. That was when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh footprints, small ones, child-sized, pressed deep into the mud, leading directly into the mine. Every instinct told him to leave, but another part of him kept thinking the same thing. What if a child really was trapped in there? He pulled away 2 loose boards and stepped inside. The air immediately became freezing cold. The tunnel stretched deep into the mountain, supported by old timber beams blackened with age and moisture. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling somewhere ahead, and deeper inside the darkness. The girl continued crying. Caleb followed the sound for several minutes until the tunnel opened into a larger underground chamber. That was when the singing stopped completely. His flashlight swept across the room. Old mining carts, collapsed supports, rusting tools. Then the beam landed on the far wall, and Caleb froze. Written across the stone in faded white paint were dozens of names, missing people. Some dated back to the 1970s, others much newer, and at the very bottom of the wall, his own name, Caleb Mercer, paint still wet. A sudden voice whispered directly behind him, "You came down here alone." Caleb spun around. A man stood at the edge of the darkness, tall, thin, covered in coal dust. His face looked almost melted into shadow, but his smile was visible. Too wide, too still. The man tilted his head slowly. "You heard her too." Caleb backed away immediately. "Who are you?" he demanded. The figure ignored the question. Instead, it pointed deeper into the mine. "That's where the others are." Then Caleb heard it. Not one child. Dozens, crying, whispering, begging for help from somewhere far below the mountain. His flashlight began flickering violently. The temperature dropped even lower, and suddenly, the man standing before him wasn't alone anymore. Shapes emerged from the darkness around the chamber. Human figures coated in black dust, some missing eyes, some with twisted limbs, all silently watching him. Caleb turned and ran. The mine behind him erupted with sounds, footsteps, screaming, metal dragging across stone, something massive moving beneath the tunnel floor. The child's voice changed completely. No longer innocent, now angry. "Don't leave us here." Caleb sprinted through the collapsing tunnel as beams cracked overhead. He could hear the figures chasing him through the darkness just behind him, their footsteps echoing unnaturally fast. Then suddenly, fresh air, moonlight. He burst out of the mine entrance and crashed into the leaves outside. Behind him, the tunnel fell silent instantly. No voices, no footsteps, nothing. Shaking violently, Caleb grabbed his gear and hiked out before sunrise without stopping once. When he finally reached the ranger station later that morning, he asked about the abandoned mine near his campsite. The ranger's expression changed immediately. He told Caleb the mine had been permanently closed after a cave-in in 1986. 7 miners had died underground. But that wasn't the worst part. Over the years, several hikers had reported hearing children crying near the tunnels late at night. 2 people had gone missing after entering the mine. Neither body was ever recovered. Caleb never returned to Frozen Head State Park. But months later, while unpacking his backpack at home, he found something buried inside one of the side pockets. A small chunk of coal, wrapped in faded paper, and written across it in shaky handwriting were 4 words. "You heard us too." Eli Mercer loved exploring forgotten places. At 26 years old, he spent most of his time hiking through the Appalachian mountains, taking photos of abandoned towns, old churches, and places people had stopped talking about years ago. For almost 4 years, Eli traveled different parts of the Appalachian Trail, searching for places hidden deep in the woods. But in November of 2024, he found a place that should have stayed hidden forever. And according to people living near Damascus, Virginia, some places in the mountains never really disappear. They wait. Eli arrived in Damascus late on a cold Thursday evening. The town looked quiet and normal. Small diners, old shops, hikers stopping for supplies before getting back on the trail. Eli checked into a cheap motel and spent the night looking at maps on his laptop. A few weeks earlier, someone had sent him an email about an abandoned settlement hidden near Iron Mountain Trail. The person claimed hikers sometimes found old stone buildings deep in the forest, but the place didn't exist on any official map. The email also included blurry photos, broken cabins, an old church bell, and one picture that really bothered Eli. It showed a small cemetery. Every gravestone was broken, except one. That single grave marker said, "Don't answer them after dark." No name, no date, just those words. Eli couldn't stop thinking about it. The next morning, he packed his camera gear and drove toward the Iron Mountain section of the Appalachian Trail. The sky was gray, and thick clouds covered the mountains. At a small gas station, an older man warned Eli about bad weather coming later that night. Then the man asked, "You hiking up there alone?" Eli nodded. The man stayed quiet for a second before speaking again. "If you hear somebody calling your name out there..." He stopped. Eli waited for him to finish. The old man looked nervous. Then he quietly said, "Make sure you know who's calling." The hike started normally. Dead leaves covered the trail, and cold air moved through the trees as Eli walked deeper into the mountains. Around noon, he noticed something strange. A wooden trail marker nailed to a tree, but it wasn't an official trail sign. The wood looked old and burned around the edges. Carved into it was a strange symbol. 3 circles connected by one straight line. Under the symbol were faded words. Hollow Creek Settlement. Eli checked his map. The place wasn't there. That should have been enough reason to leave. Instead, he followed the narrow path leading away from the main trail. At first, the trail looked abandoned, but after 20 minutes, Eli noticed something strange. The path was too clean. Broken branches, fresh footprints, leaves pushed aside recently. Something had been moving through these woods. Then he saw the footprints clearly. Bare human footprints. In the cold of November, pressed deep into the mud, leading downhill. Eli raised his voice, expecting a response from somewhere deeper in the trees. But the forest felt wrong. The usual sounds of the mountains had vanished completely. No rustling leaves, no distant animal movement, not even the creaking of branches overhead. It was the kind of unnatural stillness that made him suddenly aware of how alone he really was. About an hour later, Eli reached the hollow. The place looked unreal. Old stone foundations covered the ground. Broken cabins leaned sideways under thick vines and moss. Rusted tools lay half buried in the dirt. It looked like people had disappeared in the middle of their lives. At the center of the settlement stood a church, or what was left of one. The roof had partly collapsed, and black wooden beams stuck up into the sky. Eli slowly lifted his camera. Then he heard a voice. "Help me." It sounded like a woman. Very faint. Very far away. Eli froze. "Hello," he shouted. No answer. Then the voice came again.
"Help me!"
"Please, help me." This time it sounded closer. Coming from inside the church, every part of Eli wanted to leave, but curiosity pulled him forward. He slowly walked toward the church. The front doors hung open. Inside smelled damp and rotten. Broken benches covered the floor. Old books lay scattered everywhere. And near the front of the church, someone was standing there. A woman, facing away from him. Long dark hair, thin white dress, bare feet covered in mud. Eli felt his stomach tighten. "Are you okay?" he asked. The woman didn't move, didn't answer. Then slowly, she pointed toward a basement door beside the altar. The door stood open. Darkness filled the stairs below, and from underneath, voices. Lots of voices, whispering together. Eli couldn't understand the words, but they sounded scared. Then the woman finally spoke. "They're still down there." Her voice sounded strange, like several people speaking at once. Eli slowly stepped backward. The woman tilted her head. "You came after dark." Then she started turning toward him. Eli never fully saw her face, because the second she moved, the whispers below the church stopped. Complete silence. Then something huge moved under the floor. A loud scraping sound echoed beneath him, like claws dragging across stone. Eli ran. He burst outside into heavy rain. The storm had started suddenly. Behind him, the church bell began ringing loudly, again and again, even though there was no bell in the tower anymore. The sound echoed through the mountains. Then the screaming started. Not whispers, real screams. Dozens of people screaming from underneath the church. Eli ran between the broken buildings, slipping through mud and wet grass. Then he saw lights in the trees, lanterns, several of them, moving slowly through the forest around him. Tall figures stepped out from the darkness, carrying old oil lanterns. At first, Eli thought they were people searching for him. Then lightning flashed, and he realized something was wrong. The figures moved strangely, jerky movements like puppets. One figure lifted its lantern. Its face looked burned black. Its eyes were completely white. Eli stumbled backward. Then the figure spoke, but the voice sounded exactly like Eli. "You shouldn't have answered." Suddenly, all the lanterns went dark. Everything around him disappeared into darkness. Eli ran uphill through the forest. Rain slammed against the trees. Branches scratched his arms and face. Several times he heard footsteps behind him, matching his speed perfectly. But every time he looked back, nothing was there. Then his flashlight died. Darkness covered everything, and somewhere nearby, he heard his own voice whisper, "Eli." He froze. The voice came again, closer this time. "Eli, over here." It sounded exactly like him. Then another voice joined in, a woman crying softly, "Please don't leave us down there." Soon dozens of voices started repeating his name from every direction in the woods. Eli ran harder than he ever had in his life. Then suddenly, he burst back onto the Appalachian Trail. Moonlight shined through the clouds. The storm was gone. No rain, no wind, nothing. Eli turned around. The path leading to the settlement had disappeared. Only thick forest remained. No trail, no opening, nothing. By sunrise, Eli finally made it back to Damascus, covered in mud, shaking badly. The motel owner looked shocked when he saw him. "Where the hell have you been?" Eli frowned. "What are you talking about? You checked out 3 days ago." Eli felt sick. 3 days. That couldn't be possible. He had only entered the hollow yesterday afternoon. The motel owner looked worried. "We almost called search and rescue." Eli quickly checked his camera. Most of the photos were ruined. Only static covered the screen, except for one image, a photo taken inside the church. At first it looked blurry. Then Eli zoomed in. The woman near the altar wasn't alone. Hundreds of faces stared out from the darkness below the floorboards. Men, women, children, burned faces, crying faces, reaching upward. And in the corner of the photo stood another figure, tall, burned skin, white eyes, holding a lantern. Eli deleted the photo immediately. But sometimes, late at night, the image still appears on his phone for a split second before disappearing again. Months later, Eli finally learned the truth about Hollow Creek settlement. Old records in Bristol, Tennessee told the story. In 1911, a fire destroyed a small religious community hidden near Iron Mountain. Official reports blamed the fire on an accident during a storm, but local stories said something much worse happened. People believed the preacher of the church had gone insane. He convinced the people living there that the end of the world was coming. One night, during a church service, he locked everyone inside the building. Then he burned it down. Nobody survived. After that, hikers started reporting strange things in the area. Voices calling from the woods. Lantern lights moving through trees at night. People hearing family members calling their names from deep in the forest. Eventually, the settlement disappeared from maps completely. Like somebody wanted the place erased. Eli never went back to Iron Mountain. He stopped exploring abandoned places forever. Friends noticed he changed after that trip. He barely talks anymore. He keeps blackout curtains over every window in his apartment. And no matter what happens, he never answers voices at night. Because sometimes, right before he falls asleep, he still hears something calling his name from deep inside the mountains, using his own voice. 3 years ago, I made the mistake of driving the entire length of the Blue Ridge Parkway alone during late October. At the time, I was 31 years old and working as a freelance photographer based out of Nashville. I specialized in landscape photography, especially abandoned places and remote wilderness areas. That fall, I had been hired to create a photo series covering isolated mountain communities throughout Western Virginia. I thought it would be peaceful. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my life. The Blue Ridge Parkway feels different once the sun starts going down. During the day, it is beautiful. Endless forests painted orange and red. Old mountains rolling beneath layers of fog. Quiet little overlooks where tourists stop to take pictures. But at night, those mountains feel ancient, not old. Ancient, like something in them has been watching people long before roads were ever carved through the hills. I had spent most of the afternoon taking photos near an isolated overlook about 40 miles north of Roanoke. By the time I packed my gear, heavy fog had started moving through the valleys below. That was when I realized my car would not start. At first, I assumed the battery was dead, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. No clicking, no lights, completely dead. And of course, I had no phone signal. I remember standing there in the cold wind, staring at the empty road, thinking how strange it was that I had not seen another car in almost an hour. Then I heard someone whistle behind me. I turned and saw an older man standing near the tree line. I still do not know how long he had been watching me. He looked to be in his late 50s, wearing muddy work boots, a brown hunting jacket, and a faded camouflage cap pulled low over his eyes. His face was weathered like old leather, and he carried a flashlight, even though there was still some daylight left. "You broke down?" he asked. His voice was calm, too calm. I told him my battery was dead and asked if there was a ranger station nearby. He smiled a little and said, "No ranger stations out here. Closest help's about 20 miles south." Then he introduced himself as Earl. Earl said he lived nearby, up in the holler, with his nephews, and offered to help tow my car after dark, once they brought their truck. Something about him immediately made me uneasy. Not because he looked threatening, because he looked completely unsurprised to find me stranded there, like he had expected someone to eventually stop. Still, I did not have many options. The temperature was dropping fast, and the fog was getting thicker every minute. Earl told me there was an old service cabin nearby where I could stay warm until his nephews arrived. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We walked off the roadside and into the woods. At first, there actually was a visible trail, narrow, overgrown, probably used by maintenance workers years ago. But after 15 minutes, the trail disappeared completely. I asked Earl if we were close. He did not answer right away. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. "Folks from the city always think these mountains are empty." The deeper we went, the quieter the woods became. No insects, no birds, nothing. Just our footsteps crunching across dead leaves. Then I noticed lights moving through the trees ahead of us. Flashlights, at least 3 of them. Earl stopped walking and smiled without looking back at me. Told my boys to come meet us. Every survival instinct in my body started screaming. I immediately told him I wanted to go back to the road. Earl slowly turned around, and for the first time, the friendly expression disappeared from his face completely. "You ain't gonna find that road again by yourself," he said quietly. That was the moment I knew I was in real danger. I backed away slowly, while the lights ahead kept getting closer between the trees. Then, somewhere off to my right, I heard another whistle answer from the darkness. They had surrounded me. I dropped my camera bag and ran. Branches tore across my face as I sprinted blindly downhill through the forest. Behind me, I could hear shouting and heavy footsteps crashing through the woods. But the worst part was how calm they sounded. Nobody was yelling in panic. Nobody sounded angry. They sounded practiced, like this was something they had done before. I fell twice running down the mountain. The second time, I slammed into a creek bed, hard enough to knock the air out of my lungs. That probably saved my life, because while I was lying there trying to breathe, I noticed something through the trees below me. Headlights, a road, I scrambled downhill toward it as fast as I could, while the flashlight beams behind me bounced closer through the woods. When I burst out onto the pavement, I nearly got hit by a passing pickup truck. The driver stopped immediately after seeing the state I was in, covered in mud, bleeding from my hands, barely able to talk. He drove me straight to the sheriff's office in a nearby mountain town. When I described Earl to the deputy, his expression changed instantly. He asked me one question. Did he mention family living in the hollers? I said yes. The deputy leaned back in his chair and went completely quiet for a few seconds. Then he told me there had been multiple disappearances along isolated sections of the parkway over the last decade. Mostly travelers, mostly people alone. A few abandoned vehicles had been recovered, but the people were never found. According to locals, there were families deep in those mountains who avoided outsiders completely and protected their territory violently. The sheriff's department had investigated for years, but nobody could ever prove anything. No bodies, no witnesses willing to testify. Nothing. Before I left, the deputy told me something I still think about all the time. He said, "Out here, getting lost ain't always the thing you should fear most." I have not driven remote mountain roads alone since that night, and every time I see fog rolling through the hills, I remember those flashlights moving silently between the trees. Still searching. My name is Claire Bennett, and 2 winters ago, I inherited a fire lookout tower deep in the mountains of eastern Tennessee after my uncle died. Until then, I did not even know my family owned property there. I was living in Savannah at the time, working remote tech support and barely speaking to anyone in my family besides my mother. When the lawyer handling my uncle's estate called me, he sounded genuinely confused that the tower had been left to me specifically. According to him, my uncle had changed his will just 6 weeks before his death. The property sat somewhere near an abandoned logging settlement outside Elizabethton, accessible only by an old forestry road that was apparently closed during heavy snow. The lawyer strongly suggested selling it. Most folks around there avoid that mountain entirely, he told me. At the time, I assumed he meant because it was isolated. I know now that was not what he meant. The drive into the mountains took almost 9 hours. Once I left the highway, the roads became narrow and twisted through endless black pine forest. Every small town I passed looked frozen in time. Rusted gas pumps, collapsing churches, old men sitting silently outside convenience stores, watching traffic pass. The last gas station before the mountain was a tiny place called Mercer's Market. When I mentioned the name of the mountain to the cashier, her entire expression changed. "You headed up to Black Hollow Ridge?" she asked quietly. I nodded. She stared at me for several seconds before saying something I still think about constantly. "If you hear knocking after dark, don't answer it." Then she refused to say anything else. By the time I reached the forestry road, snow had already started falling. The lookout tower stood alone near the summit, rising above the trees on rusted steel supports. It looked abandoned at first glance, but when I climbed the stairs, I realized someone had maintained it recently. The lock had been replaced, the windows were clean, and there was fresh firewood stacked beside the door. Inside, the tower was small, but surprisingly warm. There was a cot, an old propane stove, shelves full of canned food, and dozens of notebooks stacked neatly beside a radio set that no longer worked. Most of the notebooks belonged to my uncle. At first, They seemed like ordinary journals about weather patterns and wildlife sightings. Then I found the entries about the sounds. According to my uncle, strange knocking noises echoed through the mountains almost every night after sunset. 3 knocks meant it was far away. 2 knocks meant it was moving closer. 1 knock meant you needed to turn off every light immediately and stay silent. I laughed when I first read that. My uncle had apparently spent decades alone in a mountain tower and slowly lost his mind. That night, around 1 a.m., I heard the first knock. It came from somewhere deep in the forest below the tower. A single heavy impact, like someone striking a tree with a giant hammer. About 30 seconds later, another knock answered from farther up the ridge. Then another. The sounds slowly circled the mountain. I'd remember standing by the window, trying to locate where they were coming from, when the radio beside the bed suddenly crackled to life. At first, it was only static. Then I heard a voice. "Turn off the light." The voice sounded exactly like my uncle. I froze. The radio crackled again. "Claire, turn off the light." That was when something moved between the trees below the tower. It was tall, far too tall to be human. I could only see pieces of it moving through the snowfall. But every time the moonlight hit it, I saw pale skin stretched tightly over impossibly long limbs. Then came another knock. This time, directly beneath the tower. The entire structure vibrated. I shut off the lantern instantly. For the next hour, I listened to something circling below me in the darkness. Heavy footsteps in the snow, metal creaking beneath the tower, and every few minutes, another knock. Around dawn, the sounds finally stopped. I packed my things and left immediately. Halfway down the mountain, I noticed something carved into one of the trees beside the road. Tallies, hundreds of them, and beneath the marks, carved deeply into the bark, were 5 words. "It only comes to light." When I reached Mercer's Market again, I asked the cashier how long my uncle had lived on Black Hollow Ridge. She looked at me strangely. "Honey," she said quietly, "your uncle disappeared up there in 1998. According to the sheriff's department, nobody had seen him in almost 25 years. But somebody had been stacking fresh firewood beside that tower. And whatever was knocking in those mountains still knew my name. I had been walking for 6 hours when I found the cabin. No path leading to it. No signs. Just a structure sitting in the hollow between 2 ridges on Roan Mountain. Like it had always been there. Like it was waiting. I had one rule: never shelter in an abandoned building overnight. But the storm coming down the ridge gave me no choice. I went inside. The cabin was old, maybe 100 years, maybe more. Pine walls dark with moisture, a single iron stove in the corner, 2 wooden chairs facing the window, a table with something carved into the surface. I couldn't make it out in the fading light. I dropped my pack, started a fire. That's when I noticed the door on the far wall, boarded up, not with old rotting wood, with fresh planks, recently nailed. Someone had been here, recently, and they had sealed that door like they meant it. I told myself it was just a storage room, a root cellar. I had no reason to open it. The storm hit hard around midnight, thunder rolling down the ridge like something enormous moving through the trees. I sat by the stove, half asleep. Then I heard it. Knocking, not from the front door, from behind the boarded wall. Slow, deliberate. 3 knocks. Silence. 3 more. My chest tightened. I told myself it was wind, old wood expanding. I told myself a lot of things that night. Then the knocking stopped, and a voice came through, low, barely audible, like someone with their mouth pressed flat against the wood. "Don't open it." I stood up, backed against the far wall, my hands shaking. "Don't open it. They're watching." I wanted to speak. I couldn't. My throat had closed completely. The fire went out. Darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight. Found it. Clicked it on. The beam swept across the room. The two chairs by the window. They had moved. Both facing inward now. Facing the border door. Like someone had arranged them. Like someone was sitting in them. Waiting. Watching that door with me. I grabbed my pack. Moved to the front door. Pulled it open. Rain hit me like a wall. I ran. Didn't stop until I reached the main trail. Didn't look back. I reported it to the ranger station at Carver's Gap the next morning. The ranger listened. Didn't write anything down. Just looked at me for a long moment. "Which hollow?" he asked. I described the location, the two ridges, the iron stove. He nodded slowly. "We know that cabin," he said. "We've boarded that back door 4 times. He paused. "Every time we come back, the boards are stacked neatly outside. No tools, no damage, just removed." He looked back at his desk, like the conversation was over. "We don't send anyone up there past dark anymore." He didn't explain what was behind the door. I didn't ask. Some things in these mountains don't get explained. They just wait. If this gave you chills, subscribe, because the next story is worse.